All right, in part B, we say, assume the volunteer continues to walk at this constant rate. So it's the rate that you came up with right here in this sort of yellow box. In the case of what we're using here, we're going to say it's 1.4 meters per second. So you want to figure out how long would it take them to walk 500 meters. And remember, they can do 1.4 meters per second. So I want you to think about, how could you solve this? You could maybe set up a proportion where you have 1.4 meters for 1 second, right? And then you have 500 meters up here, and we could just ask, how many seconds is that? That's one strategy that you have. You can come up with other strategies to solve this, though. Some of us are going to use maybe just a straight up division problem for some of them, maybe a multiplication problem, and that is okay. Just wanted to point out one way you could try to solve this is to set up a proportion. You could also use that same idea in part B, where it asks how far they could walk in 30 seconds, and then for part C in 10 minutes, and then part D, it's 1 hour. So remember, you're going to have to do some converting, because minutes, you're probably going to want to make that into seconds, because we only have our units for meters per second. And then you're going to want to make sure you know how many seconds there are in an hour. And if you don't know that, just remember there's 60 minutes in an hour and there's 60 seconds in a minute. So use that information to help you calculate how many seconds are there in an hour. Or you can also use, the internet to help you with that idea of how many seconds are truly in 1 hour, and verify that way as well. And then in number 2, it says, describe in words the distance in meters you could walk in a given number of seconds. So, and they don't necessarily mean you, they mean the volunteer. So you could say, use this sentence starter, they walk blank meters for every 1 second. And then say in this next piece, what if you didn't know how many seconds you were being asked about? What could you say then? In other words, what would you calculate? So you could start with, they walk blank meters for 1 second. Then how do I calculate it for an unknown number of seconds? What would you do? Would you multiply? Would you divide? That's what you want to say. And then in part 3, you're going to convert those words you just did, that you just wrote, into an equation. So you should have an equation. It says, write an equation that represents the distance d in meters that the volunteer could walk in t seconds if you maintain this pace. So take your words from number 2 and turn it into an equation. And your variables should be d for distance and t for time. And it should start with d, the distance, equals, and then remember, you also have to incorporate time. So use your rate, and then talk about what happens with the time. Are you multiplying or dividing with the time? I'm not going to say what it is. I want you to think about it. And then in number 4, you're going to talk about how long it would take to, how far you could go in 45 seconds. So in other words, you're going to put in 45 for your time in the equation that you just saw, or that you just wrote, and solve for that. If you have questions, make sure that you ask your teacher.